It is a great pleasure. This is the final Cold War Studies seminar of the semester, and it is an honor and a real pleasure to host a distinguished former professor at Harvard, Marvin Kalb, who had for many years been a journalist at various outlets in both print and TV. He covered the Cold War during its tensest moments, and he will be recounting some of those moments today. He and his brother gained international fame during the Cold War when they were among the finest broadcasters in the world covering those events. In more recent years, Marvin served as a professor at the Kennedy School in the Shorenstein program and was one of the was the founding director of it. He also more recently has been in Washington, D.C. He has published many books, including an excellent one that proved to be prescient on Russia's policy toward Ukraine. It was published a little bit after Russian annexed Crimea, and it predicted that a larger war was coming, and of course it did, tragically. But his latest book looks back at the 1960s, the first half of the 60s, during the tensest moments of the Cold War, and he will be presenting it here today. Please feel free to submit questions via either the chat feature or the Q&A, and especially the Q&A. We will be keeping track of them, and we hope to get to all of them. So please, Marvin.
Oh, well, thank you so very, very much, Mark. I'm really delighted to be with you. I remember when the Davis Center was the Russian Research Center, and that was the early days when the Cold War was in full bloom. And so many of us were here trying to study, and I must say, I got an enormous lift in my own career from the 2 years and then an additional year that I spent here. It is an enormous pleasure for me to be here, honestly. And what I'm going to do is talk for a little bit about my new book. It is the 17th book that I've done, and that would seem as if I've got nothing else to do in life but write books, but that's not quite true. Let me even show you the book, because there's an interesting point I want to make there. This is what the new book looks like, and that was me 67 years ago when I was a young CBS reporter sent to Moscow by Edward R. Murrow, who was the great journalist for CBS at that time, the man who did the great broadcast from World War II. And Murrow was a very serious broadcaster. And when he was looking for somebody to go to Moscow, he wanted someone who spoke Russian, someone who knew about Russian history, Russian literature, in those days knew about communist ideology. And I, at that time in 1957, I had written a piece for the New York Times Magazine section about Soviet youth, based upon the first polling done on Soviet youth by the communist government. And Murrow liked the piece, and he gave me a call. I was at the time on Monday morning at the Widener Library doing some work for my doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, I never quite finished. But I was working on it then, and the librarian came over and she said, "Marvin, there's a guy on the phone named Edward R. Murrow, and he says he would like to talk to you." And I said, "Edward R. Murrow is certainly not calling me. Hang up on the guy, he's probably some quack." And I don't know what she did, but that afternoon she returned and said, "The same man who sounds the same way, who says he's Edward R. Murrow, why don't you at least talk to him?" And I was saying to myself as she introduced him again, why not? And I picked up the phone, and the minute I heard his voice, I realized what a total fool I had been in not picking up the phone immediately. And Murrow invited me to come down to see him the following morning. which I did in New York. A half-hour conversation, his secretary said, no more than that. Murrow's a very busy man. I said, oh, yes, indeed. Our conversation lasted 3 hours. Murrow asked me every conceivable question about Russia. He was asking about Soviet youth, but also parents and grandparents. What was it like to shop in stores? What was it like to go to school? What was it like to be religious or not religious? He asked me all kinds of things. I did the very best I could in answering him. When it was over at noon, he put his arm around me and he said, how would you like to join CBS? I was blown away. I said, can you give me 15 seconds? And he said, sure. And I said immediately, that would be a great honor. And so I joined Murrow's staff at CBS on the July 4th weekend, as a matter of fact, in 1957. At that time, I had already been in the Soviet Union for 13 months. I was there at the US Embassy. I was a press attaché. I was also an interpreter. I was a translator. I was the young guy who sharpened pencils. I did anything the ambassador wanted. And the opportunity he gave me was to travel all over the Soviet Union to meet as many people as I could and to just report back to him with impressions that I had of conversations, of observations. And he was a great ambassador, and I had a wonderful, rich 13 months. I went back to Harvard at that point, continued working on my dissertation, was almost done when that Murrow call came through. And he hired me. And for the next 2 years, I was put on what could only be called a fast track. I was sent first to radio overnight, then radio during the day, and then television. And what I would do in this 2-year period was write a weekly report on the Soviet Union, what it is that I thought was interesting and important. And I would distribute it to the correspondents and to the producers of different programs. And toward the end of this 2-year period, my wife and I left on a 4-month trip around the world trying to study the Sino-Soviet alliance, which in our judgment was beginning to fracture. But as far as the US government was concerned, it was still very rock solid. I didn't think they were right, and they proved to be quite wrong, as a matter of fact. In May of 1960, Murrow called me into his office and said, how would you like to go to Moscow? I said, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir, I would love to. And he sent me there, and I reopened the CBS Bureau. And I then covered Nikita Khrushchev, the most fascinating Soviet politician. He was an absolute communist. He was also a Russian nationalist. He is a man who became a communist very early in his life. And I had an opportunity of sort of being introduced to him at a July 4th party. That keeps coming up. And I spoke Russian, and Khrushchev looked up at me after I was introduced by the ambassador, and he said, how tall are you? I said, I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. When he heard that, he burst into laughter. He thought it was the funniest line going. But it was a terrific in for me, because every time he saw me after that, either at the embassy or as the CBS correspondent in Moscow, he referred to me as "Вот идет Pyotr." Here comes Peter the Great. And I would be able to get through to him and ask him some questions and get answers. And in my first interview with him, which was an exclusive interview done in Paris at the summit meeting that never quite got off the ground in May of 1960. He gave me this exclusive. It was a good interview, a lot of news made. And then when I went back and into Moscow, I would see a lot of him. When I left being a journalist many years later, being a teacher, all of that, the question's often been asked, how come you ended up writing this book, A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course? This book is actually the third memoir that I have written in the last 7 years. The first one was called The Year I Was Peter the Great, which I've already given you a lead in on that. The second book was called Assignment Russia, being sent by Murrow to Russia. And this third book, A Different Russia, the reason I called it A Different Russia is that I believe that what I am describing in this book, which was essentially Khrushchev's Russia, was so radically different from the Russia that we know today, Putin's Russia. Putin's Russia is a Russia that has essentially turned its back on the West, is not looking for deals with the United States. As a matter of fact, considers the West and the United States to be hegemonic, to be evil, to be out in some way or another to damage Russia, to undercut Russia, to destroy Russia. That was not Khrushchev's idea at all. Despite the fact that both men, one was a strong Russian nationalist, Khrushchev believed that he could advance the interest of Russia by getting along with the West. And he wanted very much to travel to the West, which he did. Traveled to the United States, went out to Hollywood, came back, went to a farm, the Garst farm, and he learned a great deal there. He learned that corn could be grown in a certain kind of soil, such as they had in Moscow. So he planted corn in Moscow, learned at the Garst farm. He was the sort of man who wanted, like Peter the Great, to learn from the West to improve Russia. Putin is a totally different kind of leader, and I think it's important to understand that when the Ukraine war ends, as it will one day, and when Putin is gone, as he will be one day, there will still be a Russia. And we are still going to have to deal with Russia and understand what Russia is all about. And to me, one of the most important ways of learning about it, obviously, for me, it was to be there as a reporter, to talk to Russians, to talk to Khrushchev, to talk to as many people as I could, so that my reports would be real, they would be honest, they would be accurate, and they would be based upon a deep immersion in Russian life, what it was like. And I must say, in writing A Different Russia, I was really writing about two major figures at that moment in the Cold War. The very beginning of the 1960s were some of the darkest days of the Cold War, when there were several major crises that faced both Russia and the West. In other words, faced Khrushchev and Kennedy, and they were, as I say in the book, on a collision course. The course ended up at the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, but it started earlier. It started when Kennedy came into power on January 20th, 1961. Khrushchev had already been in power since 1955 about, And he wanted very much to reach out and deal with an American president. And he couldn't get anywhere with Eisenhower, though he met him 3 times. So he was hoping against hope that he would be able with Kennedy to really accomplish great things. And at the very beginning of the book, let me just read you to get old, as you will see, big glasses.
All right, Marvin, we're patient here.
No, but Kennedy had once appealed to Khrushchev as a genuine partner for peace. He saw in the young president an adversary with whom he thought he could do business. For a brief time, 1 month on the 1963 calendar, shortly after signing the historic atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement with the US, Khrushchev allowed himself to live in a beautiful bubble of hope. Every now and then, with his closest advisors or family members, he would imagine 6 more years of other major US-Soviet agreements that would, among other things, control the spread of nuclear weapons, settle the Berlin crisis, and lead to a period of genuine peace. Why 6 years, he was asked. Well, he'd reply, Kennedy had 2 more years in his current term and another 4 in his next term, which Khrushchev felt certain he would win. What Khrushchev did not know, could not know, was that within a month, Kennedy would be dead. And within a year, he himself would be ousted from power. When Khrushchev heard Kennedy had been shot, he cried. His dreams for a new and glorious era in Soviet-American relations had just come to a tragic end. But in Khrushchev's mind, which is so terribly important to keep in our mind in trying to understand this period of Russian history and how it sought to communicate with the United States and other parts of the West. When Kennedy took over, I was saying a moment ago, in January of 61, Khrushchev immediately put out the word. He wanted to meet with this young, new American president. He had in mind a totally unrealistic belief that if he could sit down with Kennedy, he could accomplish miracles. It did not prove to be the case. But in his mind, there were 2 conflicting avenues of thought. In one was this optimistic belief with Kennedy he could do miracle things. With the other was his very nationalistic vision of getting things that were good for Russia, advance Russian interests. And if he had to do that by dealing with the West, fine. But the basic thing was to advance Russian interests. So he had in mind a summit. He felt the summit was the ultimate accomplishment. And he managed to get that summit in June of 1961. Before he sat down with Kennedy, however, 2 major things had happened, one in February and one in April. In February, the Congo exploded in the heart of Africa, and leading the Congo was a man named Lumumba. And in Khrushchev's mind, Lumumba was the same to him in Africa as Castro would be in Latin America. And Khrushchev began to send weapons and small numbers of troops to the Congo because he figured this was his moment to expand communist influence in all of Africa. He did not calculate what Kennedy would do in response. Kennedy quietly, with the Belgians and through the UN, worked out a series of arrangements quietly that ended up with Lumumba being killed and Khrushchev's dream in the Congo being shattered. However, 6-7 weeks later, in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs fiasco took place. Cuban exiles sought to oust Castro from power. They landed on an area in the southern part of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. When they got there, they were met by Castro's army and they were shattered, absolutely destroyed. In Khrushchev's mind, that was a great advance for communism. But he was thinking about Kennedy, and he thought, if an American leader can allow this kind of mess to take place on his tour of duty, he must be weak. He certainly is young, and he's inexperienced. I might be able to take this guy to the cleaners. And he figured as he approached the summit meeting in June of 61, wow, he thought he would be able to do truly extraordinary things. He'd be able to really take them to the cleaners. They entered the summit, both of them, with the highest expectation. After the summit, it ended in a deep depression on both sides. But Khrushchev left, confirming in his mind 3 words and 3 realities in his mind about Kennedy. One was young, that was obvious, inexperienced, sort of obvious, and weak. That was a judgment call he made. And when he made that judgment call, he figured he could take a step on the biggest problem in his mind, which was the division of Berlin, and take a step that would advance Soviet interest and the interest of East Germany. And on a Sunday, I don't know if I have that here. If I do, I'd love to read just a small piece of this.
Mhm.
Yes. On August 13th, this was 2 months after the Vienna summit, the quiet Sunday was shattered. At 5 p.m. Moscow time, the distinctive voice of Yuri Levitan was heard on Moscow radio, as it often was when the Kremlin was making major announcements. With a rhythm carefully measured and a tone of such seriousness that it grabbed every Russian's attention, the famous voice disclosed the details of Khrushchev's secret plan for solving the Berlin crisis. East Germany had begun to seal the border between East and West Berlin, stopping all traffic, commercial and military, sending shockwaves through Western capitals. Khrushchev was in blatant violation of World War II agreements. Almost immediately in the Kennedy White House, the question was, what would the president do about it? Had war in Europe now become a distinct possibility? I go on. For Khrushchev, it was a gamble, what he did by putting this wall through Berlin. Khrushchev had no way of knowing how Kennedy would respond. He did, after the Vienna summit, consider the young American president to be weak and inexperienced, but still, he was upsetting the balance of forces in Berlin. And as he himself warned, light-headed leaders might misread the situation, take action, and plunge the world into unimaginable chaos. Most of the Western world speculated about an appropriate response to the building of the Berlin Wall. Pravda returned on the morning of August 14th to a familiar propaganda tune. Sealing the Berlin border was a proper decision to excise a malignant tumor in the healthy body of the German Democratic Republic. A few anxious weeks later, when it became apparent the US would take no dramatic counteraction, Khrushchev was able to breathe a sigh of relief. He had taken the measure of Kennedy in Vienna, he had gambled on Berlin, and for the time being, he had emerged a clear winner. The dangers surrounding the Berlin crisis began slowly to evaporate. What is very interesting here is this idea that in the Russian mind, in Khrushchev's mind, if Kennedy had taken action to knock down the Berlin Wall shortly after it had been set up, Khrushchev believed, and the Russians believed, and the East Germans believed, that the United States would take action, would knock down the wall, and there would be no Russian counteraction to the American action. And yet, because Kennedy did nothing, the world stood from 1961 until 1989. And that was a lost opportunity. 6 weeks later, 6 months later,
6 months, yeah.
Kennedy was in Bulgaria, and his defense minister said to him at the meeting of the Warsaw Pact that the Americans had put Jupiter missiles into Turkey, and those missiles were pointing at the Soviet Union, and he said they were operational. And Khrushchev was furious when he got that news, and he turned to his defense minister, Rodion Malinowski, and he said, "We are going to put a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, and we'll see what he does." And at that moment, he took into his head that if the United States could move Jupiter missiles into Turkey, he could move Soviet missiles into Cuba. And that is exactly what he did for the next several months, believing that the United States and Kennedy leading the US would take no action because they would know nothing. And it was amazing. If you were in Russia at that time, and it entered your mind that they would be moving 50,000 Soviet troops and Soviet missiles with nuclear warheads from all over different bases in the Soviet Union, move to the Black Sea, get on ships through the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic to Cuba, and nobody would spot it. Khrushchev had in his head that he could get away with that he thought nobody would know what was happening. And remarkably, Kennedy chose not to see what was going on in Cuba. He knew about missiles being set up. He knew there was an increase in the number of Soviet troops on the island of Cuba, but he believed it was all done defensively. It was not for an offensive military purpose. He was deluding himself. He was making a great blunder at that time. When he realized in the third week of October 62 that in fact those missiles had nuclear warheads, that there were tens of thousands of Soviet troops on Cuba, he suddenly realized that he went from defensive to offensive in his judgment. And then he operated not as a weak, young, inexperienced president, but with great courage and great strength. And he put a proposition to Khrushchev and the world. He laid a quarantine around Cuba. He stopped Soviet ships from coming in, stopped Soviet troops from coming in. And after 1 week of the most extraordinary events in Russia, and that is one of the fun parts of this book, to be able to describe day by day what was happening in Moscow at that time. It was fantastic. And on um, Sunday, October 28th, um, and I'll just run through this as quickly as I can, although.
That's all right, Marvin. You have plenty of time.
Okay, good. It was a very exciting day. On that day, I started by going to the Central Marketplace. Why? Not to buy anything, but to talk to Russians and to find out if they were as nervous as the American embassy and all of the embassies were, as the whole world was. We were on the edge of what would have been a nuclear exchange. I did not think Khrushchev was going to do it. I thought Khrushchev would somehow or another work out a deal. And on Tuesday of that week, my wife had to get opera tickets. Jerome Hines, the great American baritone, was singing Boris Godunov in Russian that night. And I said to my wife, I can't go to an opera tonight. I have to stay in the office. And she said, you're going? And of course, I caved immediately and went. And what do you think happened? We were in the fourth row, and I looked to my right. And as the lights went down, Khrushchev and four members of his Politburo and Mrs. Khrushchev arrived to watch and listen to an American opera star. We're in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he went to see and hear an American opera star. And I thought that was just fantastic, and I still think it is. And when it was over, Khrushchev led 4 standing ovations for an American, went backstage where I followed him, and he said to Jerome Hines, you've done a great thing to advance common interests. And I said to him, Mr. Minister, we're in the midst of this Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think we can get out of it without war? And he said, if you want to have peace, you can negotiate an agreement. I asked, do you think both sides want peace? Yes, he answered. What a story. It was fantastic. And he left and I ran back and did several broadcasts about what I had just heard from him. And for the rest of the week, Khrushchev kept hanging on to anything that looked like a negotiation with the American president. On that Sunday, all of the people in the marketplace I talked to said, Khrushchev, he's a little wild every now and then, but he's not going to get us into a war about Cuba. Cuba's too far away. The only thing he would fight for is Berlin. That is nearby. That is part of our history. That we would not tolerate. We would support our leader on Berlin, but Cuba seemed too far away. In my mind, I had a broadcast that seemed to say that the Russian people did not really believe that this crisis would lead to a war because they didn't think Cuba was all that important. I got to the broadcast studio, the Central Telegraph. When I got there, a Russian reporter was leaving the Telegraph. I stopped him and I said, why are you here? Do you have a broadcast you want to do? And he looked at me and he said, Levitan, Levitan. And then he ran away. Levitan is this great broadcaster. And I was saying to myself, you don't bring Levitan in to do a great broadcast unless there is great news. And I was saying to myself, it's war or peace. And my instinct was peace. So I had CBS set up an open line to New York, and we turned on the radio at exactly 5 o'clock to get the news. And it started with Yuri Levitan reading a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy in which he said flat out, I was translating live. In other words, listening to the Russian Yuri Levitan reading the Khrushchev letter to Kennedy. I was doing on a separate line to New York a translation, and I continued my translation as best I could. In order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace, to give an assurance to all people who crave peace, and to reassure the American people, the Soviet government, in addition to earlier instructions on the discontinuation of further work on weapons construction sites. We knew nothing about that. There had been a previous order to discontinue building these sites. I have now given a new order to dismantle the arms which you, Mr. President, describe as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. I screamed, he caved. I think he just caved. Can we put out a bulletin? What do you think? Yes, I shouted, but go no further than this quote. And we did that quote about packing up. We were that close to a nuclear war, and Khrushchev had the guts publicly to admit he had made a terrible mistake, and he was pulling Soviet troops, missiles, everything, crating them and getting them back to the Soviet Union. And in my mind, I kept on thinking, while putting A Different Russia, the book, together, what would Khrushchev have done now if he were, and I said, Khrushchev would never be doing what Putin is doing. Okay, what would Putin have done if he were in charge of the Soviet Union in 1962? And my sad conclusion is that Putin would never have publicly admitted a blunder of that magnitude. He would never have pulled his missiles and troops out of Cuba, and we almost certainly would have entered a war between the two superpowers, and it would have ended. Perhaps the world would have ended. But what I'm getting at is the two leaders, Putin and Khrushchev, are so radically different. And when the Putin era ends, as it will, I think myself that he is more on the way out than still locked in. And when he leaves, either because he's dead or because he's kicked out of power, but when he leaves, there will still be Russia that has to be dealt with. And we're going to have to find in this country a way of understanding Russia without sacrificing American national interests at all. Because Russia's not going to sacrifice its national interest either. But there has to be an understanding between the two sides. If Khrushchev were the leader today, I feel confident that we would reach an understanding. But because it's Putin, I have no such confidence. And that's one of the concluding elements of A Different Russia, the book itself, is that for a journalist, it was a fantastic story to be in Russia in the middle of the Cold War, to be on a sort of talking relationship with the leader of the Soviet Union. And then make a comparison to where we are today, when American reporters, for the most part, have all left Moscow because they're afraid of being arrested. And who knows, perhaps even killed. He has done that. Putin has done that to journalists. And we are at a terribly dangerous moment right now. And I truly hope that with well, I mean, I wrote the thing, so I'm proud of it, but with books such as A Different Russia, with an opening, just an effort to try to understand Russia, we will have taken a big step forward toward helping the United States, which is my principal interest. Thank you. Thank you very much for
Okay,
the
excellent. Thank
opportunity.
you, Marvin, for doing such a good job and sticking to the time that we had agreed on and really doing an excellent job of summarizing some key findings from the book. So there are questions that have come in. Let me start though with three quick ones, if I could, Marvin. And
Yes,
they
please.
are not, they are on different topics. So maybe it would be best to take notes of what they are. The first one would be you referred to Khrushchev as trying to advance Russian interests. You said that two or three times. And my sense is that Khrushchev saw himself as advancing Soviet interests. I don't think that he per se saw himself as advancing Russia. Even though, like almost all Soviet leaders, he took it, there was a Russo-centric or certainly Moscow centric dimension to the way he approached the world. So but I think he was a convinced communist and saw himself as advancing the Soviet communism above all. So that's the first question. Second one is more personal. You got to know when you were based in the Soviet Union, you got to know many Western journalists and knew them for the rest of their lives. People like Priscilla Macmillan, Nick Danilov, who recently died. Priscilla died a few years ago, and others. Do you think that being in such a repressive, closed society actually allowed for a greater camaraderie among the Westerners who were based there, the Western journalists who were based there. Otherwise, it seems a little hard to explain why, even many years later, those bonds remain so firm with the people you knew.
Yes.
And then the third question has to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. And I should add that the questions that have come in don't deal with that. So I want to ask you one initially is the when after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there was agreement with to pull out the missiles, Khrushchev was well aware that through Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy had made a pledge to dismantle the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and to pull those out after a fairly short interval without acknowledging that it was in fact a trade-off, even or it was a trade. And it was a trade. There's no doubt about that. The records on the US side show that it was seen as a trade, and that Khrushchev, and the records on the Soviet side show that it was understood that way by Khrushchev as well. So, yet, even after the Kennedy administration began reshaping in public the narrative of the crisis and presenting it as Soviet capitulation in the face of a strong firm US president who, in fact, had secretly agreed to comply with Khrushchev's demands, publicly and complying with the demand not to invade Cuba, and secretly complying with the demand to pull US missiles out of Turkey. Nonetheless, Khrushchev did not disclose that secret agreement even then, and it seems a bit odd because it was presenting the crisis as a very a very significant Soviet defeat, or at least a U.S. triumph under pressure against the Soviet Union. So, do you know why Khrushchev might have, why he didn't, in fact, publicly disclose that there had been that trade-off, especially once the missiles were out of Turkey? I would have thought that he, at that point, would have disclosed it, given that the Kennedy administration was making false claims about the outcome of the crisis. So those are your first three questions, Marvin.
Okay, now you've asked three big questions. And let me start with this issue about Khrushchev being a Russian nationalist, which was the phrase that I used. And you quite properly added that Khrushchev was also a very devout, totally committed communist. If I did not make that latter point, that is my failure, and I should have made it. The point that I was trying to make, though, is that every every aspect of this man, in my judgment, was more nationalistic than communist, although he was both. And I truly understand the point that you're making, that if he advanced the interest of Russia, he was also advancing the interest of communism all over the world. In my belief is that if you had to put 1, 2 together, you don't put them up and down, you put them side by side, the nationalism and the communism. The second point you were making about the journalists working together, and isn't it remarkable that so many years later they were still together as a group? You're absolutely right. Some of the dearest friends I had until recent years, some have already passed away, but we stayed together because we lived an extraordinary experience together. The Soviet censor censored our copy. He censored all of our copy. Nobody could go forward without their copy being cleared by a Soviet censor. So now that stopped in April of '61, but then the censorship continued in an indirect way, where you would frighten Western journalists and then kick them out of the country, make them, as like with Nick Daniloff, you arrest them, you claim that they're engaged in espionage. It simply wasn't true. You're engaged in journalism. You're trying to get information for the public. So we did. You're absolutely right. We did stay very close together. On the Cuban Missile Crisis, there it becomes again a reading of Khrushchev the man. And I feel this very strongly, and I hope I made this point. Khrushchev did something that very few other Russian leaders would have done. He did something foolish to try to move the missiles and troops into Cuba, thinking thereby he could shift the balance of power in the world away from the United States and toward the Soviet Union. I found it remarkable, foolishly remarkable, that he would believe he could get away with that. He couldn't. But when he said publicly, the line that I read, Mark, from the book, with that key paragraph about he's given an order first to take all of the missiles, wrap them up, and bring them home, and get the troops out, crate them, and get them home. That was in my judgment, a phenomenally courageous action on his part. He ended up being accused of harebrained scheming. His decision ignited a period of 2 years of very unstable leadership on his part. He did work out the one agreement with Kennedy, which he thought was fantastic, and it was. But Khrushchev did something, this acknowledgement in public of a major blunder, that I believe very few other Russian leaders would have done. Remember, he's the one in February of 1956 who also had the guts to attack the legend of Joseph Stalin and completely transform what it is that the Soviet Union was, which was a total dictatorship, into a rigid authoritarianism. What's the difference between the two? Very slight, but there is a difference in my mind. Khrushchev invited Westerners into Russia. He didn't put barriers around Russia. So that's my judgment on that. But you raised some questions, as you always do.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Marvin. So let me turn to questions from the audience. I think I'll uh, pose them for you one at a time. So one questioner asked whether in your favorable comparison, that is favorable to a Khrushchev as compared to Putin, do you risk glossing over the Soviet invasion of Hungary in October, November 1956? That is, that itself was, I mean, there were in the space of 4 days or so, there were large number, about 2,500 Hungarians killed during that invasion. And so, do you risk um, becoming a little too favorable to a Khrushchev in light of what happened there?
Yeah, well, I risk, if that be the right verb, I risk saying what I believe to be true. And I will continue to risk saying what I believe to be true, because that's what I did in 30 years as a broadcaster, and that's what I did 20 years as a professor. I will tell you what I believe, and that is what I believe. To try to see the total picture of a communist leader is a difficult and, apparently from this question, a somewhat treacherous thing to do. It is not impossible to say that this man had guts to take on Stalinism and to pull his troops out of Cuba. That did take guts if you were a communist. And as someone who lived in the Soviet Union for 5 years, I really do not need a lesson in how difficult communism can be. I lived it and I understand it. But I will continue to say what I believe to be true, and that is Khrushchev was a remarkable communist Russian nationalist leader. And I think I've covered my bases there.
Okay. Next question, Marvin. This is actually someone asking you to expand on a point you've already discussed, but it's also definitely present in the book, at least toward the end. Were there lessons from the Khrushchev period that could have been beneficially applied to U.S. post-Soviet Russian relations, and how would those be applied?
I'm not sure, Mark, that I got that whole question.
So
Forgive me.
basically, in looking at the Khrushchev period, are there lessons that you would see there that could have been applied to U.S. relations with Russia after 1991? Is there anything that could be applied today too?
Yes, and thank you very much for that question. What is applied, what I think could be applied today is a question um, about the nature of Russian society. I think it is terribly important. I've said this before, but it ought to be said again. Russia is going to be there when the Ukraine war ends, however it ends. Even if Russia is defeated in this war, which I think unlikely, but if it is defeated in this war, there is still going to be Russia that has to be dealt with. Russia has more nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, than any other country on earth, including the United States. Russia extends from the Baltic all the way to the Pacific. It is a monster country. We must do our best to understand what is going on there, because it is going to be there, and we are going to be there, and China is going to be there. And if I overstretch the use of the word nationalist, it is because I believe deep down that just as the North Vietnamese leadership was communist, it was the nationalism that drove the success of its war against the United States and earlier against the French. Nationalism is terribly important. There was a Sino-Soviet alliance that was formed immediately after China became communist in 1949. Mao Zedong came to Moscow and he stayed there for a couple of months, I think, trying to get a deal. And one of the reasons it was so difficult to get a deal, because the Chinese don't trust the Russians, and the Russians don't trust the Chinese. And they don't trust them now either. And that is not because of communism, it has to do with nationalism. And nationalism is there even alongside communism. And we've got to understand these countries. It's an essential task for us as a free country.
Marvin, I'm going to take one question out of the queue because it follows up on something you were just talking about, which is when the Sino-Soviet split emerged, which was right around the time that you were, taking your post in Moscow. Did you initially envisage how acrimonious it would become? Did you think it was a temporary rift between the two that would soon be mended, or did you envisage it as a fundamental split that would basically disunite the whole international communist movement?
Well, Mark, the answer to your question is that I have to go back a little bit. When Stalin died in 1953, March 53, ask yourself the question, how did Moscow look at that time in terms of the gloom, the emptiness of spirit, the idea that this great genius had died? What are we going to do now? In China, there was not that kind of depression. In 1956, when Khrushchev attacked the legend of Joseph Stalin, the Chinese took, I think, 7 or 9 weeks to report it as an attack on Stalin because they felt people in China might assume that was an attack on Mao. So Mao stopped it. Why was it so difficult for them to reach agreement in the 1950s? Because they didn't trust each other at that time. There had been wars along that vast border between the two countries, not huge wars, but border wars over the years. And I believe that despite the current romance between Xi in China and Putin in Moscow, I think there is a deep, continuing suspicion one of the other. And China will not allow, in my judgment, China will not allow Russia ever to be the number one anti-American country in the world, or the country that leads the underdeveloped parts of the world. No, China will decide and act on China's interest, and Russia on Russia's interest. Russia at the moment is in a bad way, and so it's kind of leans toward China rhetorically because they need China. And China is perfectly happy to take advantage of Russia's position.
Very good. Thank you, Marvin. So let me go back to the previous question, which is question submitted. I mean, not one that I raised. Is that how did you, when you were covering the Soviet Union, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you as a human being worried about the prospect of nuclear war, but on the other hand, as a journalist, you wanted to cover events as dispassionately as possible. How did you balance those two things about, trying to suppress your emotions and concerns and fears, also, what you actually thought about could be done and so forth? How did you try to balance that against actually covering the events in a straightforward way as a journalist?
Mark, that's a very good and sensitive question because it cuts to the heart of what it is to be a journalist in a tough situation and what it is to be a human being. And I can tell you that before I went to Moscow, I reached a deal with my boss. My boss was Blair Clark, who was the vice president of CBS News. When Blair was at Harvard, a classmate of his was a guy named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. They became very, very close friends. One became president, the other became vice president of a network. They also retained their personal friendship. And I had a deal with Blair that I go to Moscow if something awful happens, war, or I'm arrested, or we had to take into account the possibility that the KGB would not only arrest me, but kill me for some of the broadcasts that I was doing. How do I get Mady, my wife, out? And we reached this arrangement where whenever Blair Clark, my boss, would say to me on a radio hookup, which we had radio hookups every day, if he were to say to me, Marvin, isn't it true that you guys need a new sofa and maybe you ought to go out maybe to Helsinki or Copenhagen and buy one of those now, don't you think? I would use that as a signal that Blair knew from John Kennedy that something awful was about to happen. It didn't mean I could leave. The assumption was that I stay, but Mady goes. And when the crisis actually broke, which in Moscow, given the 8-hour time difference, was already Tuesday morning, Mady and I were listening to the president's broadcast in Moscow, and I had to do broadcasting immediately. But when there was a pause, the two of us stopped and looked at each other and said, what do we do? And we both felt deep down that Mady should stay in Moscow. She wanted to stay. I wanted her to stay. And we both believed, deep down, we could have been wrong, but we weren't, as it turned out. We both believed that Khrushchev and Kennedy would find a way out of this crisis. You could not live in Moscow for a long time, as we did, and not conclude that these people, the Russian people in the late 50s, early 60s, were only 15 years away from World War II. They did not want war. Whenever there was great tension over Berlin, I saw people in the marketplace crying out of fear that there would be a war. When Mady and I visited, I forgot the name of the town, Vladimir, a town outside of Moscow, and we just walking in the street of this small town, relatively small town, and into the marketplace. And people would see that we're not Russian, and what are you? And we both spoke Russian, so we could say we're Americans. The minute we say we're Americans, they were happy to hear that because they remembered the good things that America did for Russia during World War II. And they would say to us, please tell the president, Kennedy, please tell the president, we don't want a war. And he doesn't want a war. You were helpful once, be helpful again. You know, let's sort of take care of the tensions. I heard that every day. And you have to believe I did, perhaps wrongly, perhaps naively, I don't think so, that Khrushchev, when he jumped on the idea of a summit meeting proposed by the Secretary General of the UN, that was the second time in 7 days that he leaped at the prospect of a summit to talk his way out of it. What he said to me Tuesday night, the first day of the crisis was, we'll find a way out. We'll find a peaceful way out. What he said to Bertrand Russell on Wednesday of that week, we will find a way out. We will have a summit. He wanted a way out, and I thought he would get it.
Very good. One more question, Marvin. I think we still have ample time even for a couple more. So, one question would be, how did you assess the NATO alliance during those years and later? Because just after the period you're discussing today, Charles de Gaulle came on the scene and began challenging U.S. leadership of the Western community and pulling French forces out of the integrated military command of NATO and the like. And it seemed, given that the United States was also getting increasingly bogged down in Vietnam, it seemed that U.S. leadership at that time was in question. And I'm wondering today, given the political instability in the United States, or at least political upheavals in the United States, do you think there is a similar risk that something like that will return?
There is certainly a risk, but my sense is that the Russians saw the beginning of a Western alliance against them in a very obvious way at the beginning. This is a group of Western countries, capitalist countries, prosperous West European countries, United States behind them, that could pose a direct threat to the Soviet Union, to Mother Russia. And they were frightened by that, but Stalin knew that he had to avoid a war because he would lose them. He was not a fool. And when he died in 1953, the Russians were still very much behind the West. And that was one of the reasons for the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Khrushchev imagined that he could shift it around so that the Soviet Union would be regarded militarily and strategically as stronger than the West, stronger than NATO and the US. When Khrushchev realized, after his defeat in Cuba, and Mark, I will get back to the idea of a deal with the Jupiter things. I regard it as a public defeat for the Soviet Union, which is what Khrushchev did in his harebrained way. The idea has always been, does Russia believe that it is so strong that it can take on the West and beat the West? The reason I said in the conclusion of my talk about a different Russia, I made the point that we're in a very dangerous time now. I mean that for one particular reason, and that is that Putin has put out so much propaganda about the strength, the military strength of Russia, this new missile that they just fired into Ukraine as an example that there is nothing that the West has that can bring that missile down. That's what he claims. If in his mind he truly believes that Russia has the military and strategic strength to beat the West, to beat NATO, we are in a messy, dangerous moment. Because Putin may even persuade himself that he can take the United States to the cleaners, as Khrushchev thought he could take Kennedy to the cleaners, until he found out he couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a question, Marvin, on the role of the Soviet military during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you The questioner asked whether you believe that the Soviet military restrained Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That has prevented him from resorting to nuclear war or some other reckless coercive action that might have threatened nuclear war. And my own view is that the Soviet military actually wanted to pursue that option, far from restraining Khrushchev. But in any case, let me ask your view of it.
Um, Number one, if you're in Moscow in 1960, 61, 2, 3, what are your sources of information as a Western journalist? You read the press, the Soviet press, very carefully. You try as best you can to be invited to as many Kremlin functions as possible, so you might, in that environment, get a chance to talk to a Russian leader. Third, you want to travel around the country as much as possible and talk to ordinary Russians, get a feel for what it is that they think. And then, if you're interested in the military, you read the Russian newspaper Red Star. Does Red Star have accurate information? No. You have to read it very carefully, measure what it says against what Pravda is saying, and 99% of the time they're saying the same thing. So being a reporter in Moscow at that time was making judgment calls almost every single day based on your reading of the press, your own exposure to Russian leaders or the Russian people. You're traveling around the country, you get a sense of things. And if you were a journalist who spoke the language, who knew about the history of Russia, you get a feel for things above and beyond what it is that was in the press.
By the way, I should add, my comments were based on looking at some of the archival materials. One thing that is remarkable is that the tradition of military subordination to civilian control held up through the crisis. That is, it was not violated. The military officers like Ilya Pliev, the commander of Soviet forces on Cuba, then the commander-in-chief of Soviet strategic forces, Marshal Biryuzov, and others wanted, it seemed, to resort to military force, but they did not disobey the civilian authorities. So it was quite remarkable that even during the most stressful circumstances, that succeeded, that tradition. So it can, it's in conformity with what you have said here and what you say in the book. One last question, if I could, Marvin, which has to do with going back. This is an elaboration of, and again, it's not my question. I'm asking one from the audience, is about the lessons from this period, the early, first half of the 1960s. What do they hold out as well about what the United States could do domestically as well as in foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis Russia? But are there things that you learned from that period, looking back at the United States from afar, that during the time you were in Moscow, that you think could be reliably used today? Or is there simply different circumstances now, 60 years later?
Mark, I may be repeating myself, but my sense is that in the 1960s, if you were an intelligent American in the United States and you wanted to, and you felt it was important for the US to get along with the Soviet Union, the most important thing was to maintain as open a relationship as you could between the two sides. Kennedy in 1962, because he was reaching out to the Russian people, delivered a speech at American University in June of 63, which I would urge people, I mean, person who raised that question. And Mark, you yourself, you probably read it 15 times. The speech that he delivered at American University is the most extraordinary speech that an American, especially an American president, could deliver about Russia and the Russian people. He was so sympathetic to what it is that the Russians had gone through during World War II. The number of people, the tens of millions of people who were killed, the towns and cities, villages that had been literally leveled. And he expressed the deepest personal and national feelings of himself and the American people toward what the Russians had experienced during the war. Khrushchev was so touched by the apparent sincerity, I think the real sincerity indeed, and the words that the president used. He had Moscow television run the entire speech twice, and then he put it on Moscow radio 3 times, and he had it run in full in the communist newspapers throughout the country, because it was to Khrushchev a reaching out beyond political leaders of people to people. And Khrushchev was a big people guy. And as a communist and as a nationalist, wanted very much to improve the lives of the Russian people, if it were only to demonstrate that communism was a great system of government. If that be the only thing, and that's what you believe, fine. But I believe it was more than that. He wanted to prove that Russia is a great nation that people ought to look up to. And he knew that they couldn't look up to it because it was sort of, and remains to this day, backward in many respects. So could we learn? Oh, yes. And that would be a good place to start.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Marvin. I do want to mention a couple of things at the end as we end here. One is that I did not pass on the fan comments that came in like, Marvin, you are amazing. What a pleasure to see and hear you. Another thank you, Marvin, for a marvelous talk. I like marvelous Marvin. But anyway, and then finally, my own comment is, Marvin, you're now 94. You look about 25 years younger. You are still writing books.
Not the
You're
way.
still writing books and speaking with great lucidity. So how do you do it?
Mark, each day, believe me, is a miracle. And one of the things that keeps me going is A Different Russia. This book is my 17th book. And if you go through a life that has been as rich as mine, you must be grateful for what it is that you experience and be able to share it. And what is terribly important to me is that I have an opportunity with a book like this to share with my readers what it was like to be there then. You meet through a book like this, you meet political leaders such as Khrushchev and Kennedy. It's almost as if you were there with me interviewing these people. And you were in Cuba and you were in Moscow. It's an exciting, wonderful thing. And I go day by day. And, you know, what the heck? Let's all be optimistic, no matter how troubled we may be at the moment in this country. Let us hope that things will get better. Let us hope so.
Excellent. Thank you, Marvin. I look forward to hosting your next book and
Thank you.
seminar on your next book. And I want to thank you a great deal for today's seminar.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all.